The silence stretched across the briefing room like a taut wire, broken only by the distant thrum of rotors warming up on the tarmac. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hendricks stared at the satellite feed, his weathered face carved into deeper lines by the blue glow of the monitors. Somewhere in the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan, 12 Navy SEALs had gone dark. Their last transmission crackled through the speakers for the 15th time. Overwatch, this is Neptune 6. We are heavily engaged. Request immediate extract. Multiple KIA. We are pulling back to secondary LZ. Then nothing but static, and the wait of 24 hours without contact. The rescue mission briefing had drawn every available pilot to the forward operating base. Apache gunships, Chinook heavies, even a pair of Air Force PAVE Hawks, all grounded by weather that meteorologists described with clinical detachment as unsurvivable flying conditions. Wind shear that could snap a helicopter's rotor mast. Cloud ceiling so low it kissed the mountain peaks. Snow squalls that turned visibility to zero in seconds. Captain Raven Blackthorne stood at the back of the room, her slight frame almost invisible among the broader shoulders of her male counterparts. She listened to the arguments, the tactical assessments, the careful calculations of acceptable risk versus mission necessity. They spoke around her, through her, as if her presence was merely administrative, another checkbox on the diversity roster rather than 4,000 flight hours earned in some of the most hostile airspace on Earth. Her call sign had been born of mockery. Blackthorn, the thorny bird, they'd called her during flight school, referencing both her surname and her tendency to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. The name stuck, but its meaning had evolved through years of flying medical evacuations in Iraq, supply runs through Syrian no-fly zones, and insertion missions that required threading aircraft through spaces measured in meters rather than miles. The base commander, Colonel Sarah Chen, finally voiced what everyone was thinking. We need someone crazy enough to fly in this weather and skilled enough to survive it. Her eyes swept the room, landing on faces she'd watched mature through combat tour. Each pilot she considered shook their heads or found sudden interest in their flight manuals. I'll take it, Blackthorn said quietly. The room turned toward her voice as if surprised to discover she'd been there all along. Some faces showed skepticism. Others, poorly concealed amusement. She was 5'4" in boots, with graying temples that betrayed 38 years of life and 15 years of military service. Her aircraft, a modified US-60 Black Hawk she'd nicknamed Thornbird, was older than some of the pilots in the room. But her record spoke in languages louder than mockery. Colonel Hendricks studied her personnel file on his tablet. 3 distinguished flying crosses, 2 silver stars, a Purple Heart earned when she flew wounded Marines to safety, while her own aircraft leaked hydraulic fluid and hope in equal measure. The kind of record that made seasoned warriors reconsider their assumptions about who belonged in the sky when death was the most likely outcome. The weather outside howled against the briefing room windows, nature's own artillery barrage against the notion that 12 Navy SEALs might see another sunrise. But Raven Blackthorn had made a career of flying into impossible situations and returning with precious cargo intact. Today would test whether that career had been built on skill or luck. The mission clock began ticking the moment she stood to leave the briefing room. Somewhere in the mountains, elite warriors were counting down their remaining ammunition and measuring their lives in minutes rather than hours. The rescue that everyone deemed impossible had just become her responsibility. Her boots echoed against the hangar floor as she walked toward Thornbird, each step carrying the weight of expectation and the whispered doubts of colleagues who'd forgotten that the most dangerous battles were often won by those with nothing left to prove except that they belonged in the fight. The pre-flight inspection revealed what she already knew. Her aircraft was mechanically sound but cosmetically weathered, bearing the scars of too many missions in too many hostile environments. Panel 47 still showed dimpled metal from small arms fire over Ramadi. The tail rotor assembly had been replaced twice, first in Germany, then again at Bagram. Her crew chief, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, ran practiced hands over every critical system while Blackthorn reviewed the mission parameters one final time. The navigation charts showed terrain that rose like jagged teeth from the valley floor. The target landing zone sat at 8,400 feet elevation, surrounded by peaks that climbed another 3,000 feet into clouds heavy with snow and malice. Weather reports painted a picture of conditions that would challenge even the most advanced aircraft, let alone a Black Hawk that had seen better decades. "Ma'am," Santos called over the wind, "hydraulic pressure is green, but I'm showing intermittent fluctuations on the secondary system. Nothing outside normal parameters, but worth monitoring." The sergeant's concern was evident despite her professional tone. They'd flown together for 18 months, long enough for Santos to read the subtle signs that preceded Blackthorn's most audacious decisions. Blackthorn nodded, making a mental note to watch the hydraulic gauges more closely than usual. In mountain flying, especially in weather like this, hydraulic failure could transform a difficult landing into a controlled crash. The margin for error was already thinner than the air they'd be breathing at altitude. The radio crackled to life with air traffic control's final clearance. "Thornbird, you are cleared for departure. Winds 270 at 22 knots, gusting to 35. Cloud ceiling at 8,000 feet and lowering. Advisory, all other aircraft remain grounded due to unsafe conditions." She keyed the microphone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "Tower, Thornbird copies all. Departing for Neptune 6 rescue operation. ETA to target 97 minutes. The transmission was heard not just by air traffic control, but by every pilot, crew chief, and support staff monitoring the emergency frequency. Some listened with professional interest. Others with the morbid fascination reserved for watching someone attempt the impossible. The rotors spun up with their familiar wop-wop-wop, the sound that had become the soundtrack to her adult life. Santos secured the cabin and gave the thumbs-up signal. Co-pilot Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a quiet professional with 6 months in-country, completed his instrument checks with methodical precision. The crew was smaller than usual, just essential personnel to minimize weight and maximize fuel capacity. As Thornbird lifted off, Blackthorn felt the familiar sensation of gravity releasing its hold, replaced by the more demanding physics of rotor-driven flight. The aircraft rose into air that grew thinner and more turbulent with each foot of altitude. Below, the forward operating base shrank to a collection of lights struggling against the approaching darkness of both night and weather. The first real test came as they entered the mountain valleys, where wind patterns became unpredictable and deadly. Blackthorn felt the aircraft shudder as crosswinds tried to push them into canyon walls that rose on either side like stone guardians. Her hands moved constantly across the controls, making minute adjustments that kept them centered in airways measured in yards rather than miles. Morrison monitored the navigation systems, calling out waypoints and course corrections while simultaneously watching weather radar that painted the sky ahead in ominous shades of yellow and red. "Storm cell directly ahead, about 15 miles out," he reported. "Looks like we'll be flying right through it." The first drops of snow appeared on the windscreen, followed quickly by a steady accumulation that forced Blackthorn to rely increasingly on instruments rather than visual references. The mountains disappeared into gray obscurity, leaving only the green glow of radar returns and the steady rhythm of radio navigation beacons to guide them toward their destination. At 8,200 feet, they encountered the cloud ceiling that had grounded every other aircraft. Visibility dropped to near zero as they entered a world of gray cotton that seemed to press against the aircraft from all directions. The Black Hawk bucked and twisted in the turbulent air, each gust threatening to exceed the structural limits of an airframe that had already endured more stress than its designers had intended. "Thornbird, this is Overwatch," came the voice of the Tactical Operations Center. "We're showing you entering the restricted zone. Are you maintaining course?" Blackthorn keyed her microphone while simultaneously adjusting collective pitch to maintain altitude in the thinning air. Overwatch Thornbird. Roger, continuing to target, weather as advertised but manageable. The word manageable was a significant understatement, but admitting the true severity of conditions would only increase pressure to abort the mission. They flew deeper into the storm, guided by GPS coordinates that represented the last known position of 12 warriors who might already be beyond rescue. Each mile brought new challenges: icing on the rotor blades, electrical disturbances that played havoc with communication systems, and wind shear that could flip an aircraft inverted in seconds. The radio suddenly burst to life with a transmission that made everyone in the aircraft sit straighter. Any station, this is Neptune 6 actual. We are alive and in defensive positions. Immediate extract required. We have wounded. The SEALs were alive. The mission had just become a race against time, weather, and whatever enemy forces had pinned down some of America's most elite warriors. Blackthorn pushed the aircraft harder through conditions that would have sent any reasonable pilot back to base. Ahead, through the swirling snow and cloud, lay answers to questions that had haunted the Tactical Operations Center for 24 hours. Behind them, a forward operating base full of experienced pilots wondered if they'd just witnessed someone's final departure or the beginning of a legend. The Hindu Kush Mountains had claimed aircraft and crews before, adding their names to a list of those who'd challenged the peaks and lost. But Raven Blackthorn had never been particularly concerned with reasonable odds, and today would either validate 15 years of defying conventional wisdom or add her name to that same list. The storm intensified, as if sensing their determination to continue. The GPS coordinates led them deeper into terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god, peaks that rose without warning from valleys shrouded in clouds, ridgelines that appeared suddenly in the windscreen like accusatory fingers pointing at their presumption. Blackthorn flew by instruments and instinct, the former providing data, while the latter whispered warnings about wind patterns and elevation changes that couldn't be read on any display. "Contact bearing 270, Morrison announced, his voice tight with concentration. "I'm getting intermittent radar returns. Could be our boys." He worked the controls of their modified targeting system, trying to distinguish between snow-covered rocks and human signatures in an environment that seemed designed to confuse electronic sensors. The radio crackled again. "Thornbird, Neptune 6. We can hear your rotors but negative visual. Weather is 00 down here. Be advised, we took contact from multiple positions around the LZ. Hostiles may still be active in the area." Blackthorn felt her jaw tighten. A hot landing zone meant the SEALs weren't just weathered in, they were pinned down by enemy fire in conditions that made tactical movement nearly impossible. The rescue had just evolved from difficult to potentially suicidal. She keyed the microphone. "Neptune 6, Thornbird copies. Can you mark your position with infrared strobes?" "Negative, Thornbird. Lost most of our signaling gear in the initial contact. We're using voice guidance only." Flying blind into a potential firefight represented everything the military taught pilots not to do. Standard doctrine called for reconnaissance, fire support, and multiple extraction options. Today, they had none of those luxuries, only the voice of a SEAL team leader talking them toward a landing zone that might be zeroed by enemy mortars or machine gun positions. Santos's voice came through the internal communication system. "Ma'am, I'm seeing muzzle flashes through the snow at 10 o'clock. Looks like small arms fire, maybe 200 meters from our current position." Her voice remained professionally calm, but Blackthorn could hear the underlying tension. They were flying into an active combat zone in weather that made defensive maneuvering nearly impossible. The first rounds impacted the aircraft as they descended toward what Neptune 6 described as their position. The distinctive crack of small arms fire mixed with the whop of rotor blades, creating a percussion section that every combat pilot learned to fear. Morrison called out hits, taking fire from multiple positions. No critical systems affected yet, but were definitely in someone's crosshairs. Blackthorn pushed the aircraft into a defensive spiral, using altitude and the storm itself as concealment while trying to maintain contact with the SEAL team below. The Black Hawk shuddered as larger caliber rounds found their mark, chewing through aluminum skin and non-critical systems. A hydraulic warning light flickered amber, then steadied. Santos's earlier concern about system fluctuations suddenly became critically relevant. "Neptune 6, I need you to talk me down," she transmitted. "Visibility is 0 and we're taking effective fire. Give me bearing and distance from your position." The SEAL team leader's voice came back steady despite the obvious sounds of combat in the background. "Thornbird, you're about 300 meters northeast of our position. Come left about 40 degrees and descend. We'll try to suppress the fire from the ridgeline, but this LZ is getting smaller by the minute." She could hear automatic weapons fire through the radio transmission, the distinctive sound of American M4 carbines mixed with the different signature of AK-47s. The battle below was ongoing, with her aircraft drawing attention that made the SEALs' tactical situation even more precarious. The altimeter showed 8,600 feet as they descended through air so thick with snow that the rotor downwash created its own localized blizzard. Blackthorn flew by feel and experience, reading the aircraft's behavior for clues about ground proximity and wind patterns. The Black Hawk wanted to settle into the thin air, fighting her attempts to maintain controlled flight in conditions that pushed every system to its operational limits. "Taking heavier fire," Morrison reported, his voice strained as he monitored multiple systems showing amber and red warning lights. "Port engine temperature climbing. We may have taken a hit in the intake system." A wounded aircraft in mountain weather was a combination that had killed more experienced pilots than Blackthorn cared to count. The margin for error, already razor-thin, had just disappeared entirely. They were committed now, too deep into hostile territory to turn back, flying an aircraft that might not have enough power to climb back over the peaks that surrounded them. Through the snow and gunfire, she caught her first glimpse of the landing zone, a small clearing surrounded by rocks and enemy positions, marked only by the muzzle flashes of SEAL team weapons trying to keep hostile forces at bay. It was smaller than briefed, surrounded by obstacles that would make approach and departure difficult even in perfect conditions. But 12 American warriors were down there, counting on her to perform the impossible. The descent toward the landing zone felt like flying into the mouth of hell. Tracer rounds streaked past the windscreen in lazy arcs that belied their lethal velocity, while the Black Hawk bucked and fought in air turbulence created by the interaction of rotor downwash with mountain winds and falling snow. Blackthorn's hands moved continuously across the controls, making microscopic adjustments that kept them centered on an approach path measured in degrees rather than comfortable margins. "Neptune 6, Thornbird is inbound. Pop smoke if you have it," she transmitted, hopping for any visual reference to help distinguish friendly from hostile positions in the swirling chaos below. The response came back immediately. "Negative on smoke, Thornbird. All signaling devices lost or damaged. You'll have to land on voice guidance only." Morrison's instruments painted an increasingly grim picture. Port engine oil pressure dropping. Temperature redlined. We're going to lose power on that side soon. The announcement carried implications that every pilot understood but none wanted to voice. A Black Hawk could fly on one engine under ideal conditions, but these were far from ideal, and the power required for high-altitude operations was already pushing their remaining engine beyond normal parameters. At 200 feet above the landing zone, Blackthorn could finally make out individual figures moving among the rocks, dark shapes that resolved into the distinctive silhouettes of American Special Operations personnel. They were arranged in a defensive perimeter, their weapons oriented toward high ground that presumably held enemy positions. Several figures lay motionless, confirming the presence of casualties that would need immediate medical evacuation. The first SEAL reached the aircraft before the wheels touched snow-covered ground. Staff Sergeant Kyle Reeves, his face streaked with blood from a shrapnel wound, began directing wounded teammates toward the cargo bay while simultaneously maintaining fire discipline toward suspected enemy positions. His movements showed the controlled aggression of someone who'd spent the last 24 hours balancing between life and death. "We've got 3 urgent surgical, 2 routine, 1 expectant," he shouted over the rotor noise, using medical triage categories that told their own story of the firefight that had decimated Neptune 6. The expectant category, reserved for wounded who were beyond saving, represented someone's son or brother who'd already paid the ultimate price in these unforgiving mountains. Santos jumped from the aircraft to help load casualties, her medical training taking priority over her crew chief duties. The wounded SEALs moved with the mechanical efficiency of professionals who understood that survival often depended on suppressing individual pain in service of team objectives. One operative with a shattered leg helped carry a teammate whose chest wound had soaked through multiple field dressings. Enemy fire intensified as hostile forces realized the rescue operation was succeeding. Rounds impacted the fuselage with metallic pings and tears, while larger caliber weapons sent bullets through spaces where human beings had been standing seconds before. The Black Hawk's armor protection was designed for small arms fire, not the sustained assault they were currently enduring. "We need to go now," Reeves called out, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who could read tactical situations with professional precision. "They're maneuvering for better positions. We'll be zeroed in about 2 minutes." He helped the last wounded SEAL into the aircraft while simultaneously scanning the high ground for muzzle flashes that indicated enemy movement. Blackthorn felt the aircraft settle slightly as the additional weight of 12 personnel pushed the Black Hawk closer to its operational limits. The port engine temperature gauge showed readings that were beyond red, entering the range where catastrophic failure became not just possible but likely. They had perhaps minutes of power remaining before the engine seized entirely. The takeoff was a controlled emergency, requiring more power than the struggling aircraft could safely provide, while carrying maximum payload at high altitude in hostile weather. Blackthorn pulled collective pitch aggressively, trading rotor RPM for altitude while praying that the remaining engine could sustain the demand being placed upon it. At 50 feet, the port engine died with a shudder that felt like the aircraft's death throes. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit like a malevolent Christmas tree, while audible alarms competed with enemy gunfire for the crew's attention. They were now flying on one engine, overweight, in weather that had defeated every other rescue attempt. Morrison's voice was clinically calm as he shut down the failed engine and transferred all power management to the starboard power plant. "Single engine operation confirmed. We're at maximum continuous power with no margin for maneuvering. Recommend direct route to nearest suitable landing area." The mathematical reality was stark. They might have enough power to maintain level flight, but climbing over the peaks that surrounded them would require performance the aircraft could no longer provide. They were trapped in a valley with an aircraft that was dying one system at a time, carrying wounded who would die without immediate medical attention. But Raven Blackthorn had built her reputation on finding solutions where mathematics suggested none existed. The valley exit required climbing to 9,200 feet, a gain of 600 feet, with an aircraft operating at the edge of aerodynamic possibility. Blackthorn began what pilots called terrain masking, using the natural contours of the mountains to gain altitude gradually while staying below ridge lines that would expose them to both enemy fire and the worst wind effects. It was a technique that required intimate knowledge of mountain flying and absolute faith in the aircraft's diminished capabilities. Santos worked frantically in the cargo bay, applying pressure dressings and administering field medications to casualties whose injuries ranged from shrapnel wounds to compound fractures. The SEAL medic, despite his own injuries, continued providing care to teammates whose conditions were deteriorating during the prolonged evacuation flight. Their quiet professionalism provided a stark contrast to the mechanical drama unfolding in the cockpit. Thornbird Overwatch came the voice of the Tactical Operations Center, monitored by staff officers who were tracking the rescue mission's progress through satellite feeds and radio intercepts. "We show you departing the target area. What's your status?" Blackthorn keyed the microphone while simultaneously adjusting power settings to maintain their precarious climb. "Overwatch, Thornbird. We have Neptune 6 aboard with multiple casualties requiring immediate medical attention. Aircraft has sustained damage and is operating on single engine. Proceeding to base via alternate route." The alternate route was pilot terminology for "we're too damaged to fly over the mountains, so we're going to thread through valleys and hope the weather doesn't kill us." It was a longer path that would consume more fuel and time, both of which they had in limited supply, but it offered their only realistic chance of reaching medical facilities alive. The surviving engine temperature gauge climbed steadily as the single power plant worked beyond its design specifications. Morrison monitored oil pressure and turbine inlet temperature while calculating fuel consumption rates that would determine whether they could reach base or would be forced to attempt an emergency landing in hostile territory. The numbers were uncomfortably close to the margins that separated successful missions from disasters. At 8,800 feet, they encountered the cloud layer again, but this time from below. Visibility dropped to zero as they entered the gray world that had challenged their inbound flight. The difference now was that they were flying a wounded aircraft with reduced power, carrying human cargo that couldn't survive another forced landing. The stakes had risen beyond the merely professional into the realm of moral imperative. The radio transmission from Neptune 6 Actual came as they struggled through the worst of the weather. "Thornbird, our medic says Johnson won't make it without immediate surgery. He's lost too much blood, and the chest wound is beyond our field capabilities." The message carried weight that transcended tactical concerns. A young warrior's life balanced against an aircraft's declining ability to maintain flight. Blackthorn pushed the Black Hawk harder through weather that seemed determined to claim them all. Ice accumulated on the rotor blades, creating vibrations that made precision flying nearly impossible. The artificial horizon gyroscope had begun processing, showing attitude information that contradicted her inner ear and the aircraft's actual position. She flew by instinct and experience, using subtle cues from engine sound and control response to maintain controlled flight when instruments couldn't be trusted. The first clear air they encountered revealed their position relative to the mountain peaks, still trapped between ridgelines that rose above their current altitude, with insufficient power to climb directly over obstacles that would allow a straight-line course to medical facilities. They would have to continue following valley systems that added distance and time to a flight profile already stretched beyond safe parameters. But through the cargo bay, she could hear Santos coordinating with the SEAL medic to keep wounded warriors alive long enough to reach definitive care. Their quiet competence in the face of impossible circumstances reminded her why she'd chosen to fly this mission when everyone else had declared it suicidal. They were going to make it, or they were going to die trying. In the world of military aviation, sometimes that was the only choice that mattered. The flight back to base became a mechanical meditation on the relationship between human determination and the laws of physics. Every mile consumed fuel they couldn't spare, while pushing an engine beyond its sustainable operating envelope. Morrison managed power settings with the precision of a surgeon, balancing the immediate need for altitude against the long-term requirement to keep the turbine rotating until they reached friendly territory. The wounded SEALs maintained the disciplined silence of professional warriors, even those whose injuries would have reduced civilians to screaming. Johnson, the most critically wounded, remained conscious despite blood loss that had turned his skin the color of old paper. The team medic continued working on him with supplies salvaged from individual first aid kits, performing battlefield medicine that was keeping their teammate alive through sheer competence and determination. "Fuel state is critical," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone reading numbers that define their operational future. "We have maybe 20 minutes at current consumption rate, but that's assuming no additional power demands for weather or emergency procedures." 20 minutes represented the difference between landing at a medical facility, equipped to handle trauma surgery, and being forced down in terrain that would turn wounded warriors into statistics. Blackthorn adjusted course slightly to follow a valley system that offered the most direct route while still providing terrain clearance for their current altitude capabilities. The radio crackled with transmissions from the forward operating base as medical personnel prepared for incoming casualties and maintenance crews readied equipment to assess aircraft damage. But underlying the professional coordination was something else, a recognition that the mission everyone had declared impossible was somehow succeeding against odds that defied rational calculation. "Thornbird, this is Colonel Chen. Medical is standing by for your arrival. What's your ETA?" Blackthorn checked her navigation display and fuel consumption calculations before responding. "Overwatch. Thornbird estimates 12 minutes to base, assuming no additional complications. Request priority landing and immediate ground transport for casualties to the surgical unit." The response came back immediately. "Thornbird, you are cleared straight in, all traffic holding clear. Fire and rescue standing by. Outstanding work getting our people out of there." The acknowledgement from her commanding officer carried weight beyond its tactical significance. Chen had been skeptical of the mission from the beginning, not because she doubted Blackthorn's skills, but because the weather and tactical situation seemed to preclude any successful outcome. The fact that they were returning at all represented a vindication of the decision to attempt the impossible. At 8 minutes out, the surviving engine began showing signs of imminent failure. Oil pressure fluctuated wildly, while exhaust gas temperature spiked beyond redline limits. The turbine was literally consuming itself to maintain power output, trading future operational capability for the immediate requirement to keep 12 American warriors airborne long enough to reach medical attention. Santos had established an IV line for Johnson and was monitoring his vital signs with equipment designed for battlefield use. His pulse was weak but steady, blood pressure maintained through sheer willpower, and the medical intervention of teammates who refused to accept that anyone else would die in these mountains. The other casualties remained stable, their injuries serious but not immediately life-threatening. The lights of the forward operating base appeared through the snow like a constellation of hope against the hostile darkness of the Hindu Kush. The runway lights, hangar illumination, and medical facility floods created a beacon that drew the wounded Black Hawk toward safety with gravitational inevitability. They had somehow traversed impossible terrain in unsurvivable weather, while maintaining the delicate balance between human need and mechanical limitation. Blackthorn felt the aircraft settle onto the taxiway with a finality that suggested the Black Hawk had given everything it could possibly provide. The engine wound down with mechanical sounds that indicated permanent damage to systems that had exceeded their operational envelope. They had arrived, but Thornbird would need extensive repair before flying again. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft before the rotor blades stopped turning, their practiced efficiency transforming wounded warriors from battlefield casualties to hospital patients within minutes. Johnson was first out, his stretcher surrounded by trauma specialists who continued the life-saving work begun by his teammates in conditions that had challenged everyone's professional abilities. As the casualties were loaded into waiting ambulances, The SEALs who remained mobile gathered around Blackthorn with expressions that conveyed gratitude beyond what military protocol could adequately express. Staff Sergeant Reeves, his face bandaged but his eyes clear, extended his hand toward the pilot who had brought them home. "Ma'am," he said simply, "we owe you our lives." The words carried the weight of absolute sincerity, spoken by a warrior whose profession required precise evaluation of life-and-death situations. In the space of 4 hours, Raven Blackthorn had flown into conditions that grounded every other aircraft, landed in an active firefight, and returned with human cargo that everyone had written off as casualties of war. The rescue mission was complete, but its implications were just beginning to resonate through the military community that had witnessed something approaching legend unfold in real time. Colonel Chen appeared at Blackthorn's shoulder as the medical teams departed with their patients. The base commander's expression mixed professional satisfaction with something approaching awe, the recognition that she had just observed aviation skill that transcended normal expectations of human capability under extreme stress. "Preliminary reports indicate all casualties will survive," Chen said, her voice carrying the controlled relief of a commander who had authorized a mission many considered suicidal. "Johnson is going into surgery now, but the medical team is optimistic about his prognosis. You got them out in time." The words represented more than a tactical update. They confirmed that the mathematical gamble of flying damaged aircraft through hostile weather had paid dividends measured in human lives rather than mission statistics. 12 Navy SEALs would return to their families because someone had been willing to attempt what conventional wisdom declared impossible. As maintenance personnel began their assessment of Thornbird's battle damage, the extent of the aircraft's sacrifice became apparent. The port engine was completely destroyed, its internal components fused by temperatures that had exceeded metallurgical limits. The fuselage showed dozens of bullet holes, some passing through areas where crew members had been seated during the firefight. The hydraulic system had sustained multiple hits, maintaining pressure through redundancy, and the kind of luck that military personnel learned to appreciate without relying upon. Santos ran her hands over the damaged aircraft with the affection reserved for machines that had performed beyond their design specifications when human lives depended on mechanical reliability. "She gave us everything she had," the crew chief said quietly. "Every system that mattered kept working when it counted." The Black Hawk had indeed provided everything required for mission success, but at a cost that would require months of repair and component replacement. In the harsh calculus of military operations, trading one aircraft for 12 elite warriors represented an acceptable exchange rate, but pilots developed personal relationships with their machines that transcended purely economic considerations. Morrison completed his post-flight inspection with methodical attention to detail, documenting systems failures and battle damage for the maintenance reports that would tell the technical story of their survival. His logbook entries would become part of the official record, preserving for future analysis the mechanical decisions that had kept them airborne when probability suggested catastrophic failure. But beyond the technical documentation lay something more significant: the transformation of Raven Blackthorn's reputation from competent but underestimated pilot to someone whose skills had been tested under conditions that revealed character along with capability. The mission had proven what she had always known, but rarely had opportunity to demonstrate. That expertise developed through years of difficult flying could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable to conventional thinking. The base communications officer approached with a message that would formalize what everyone already understood. "Ma'am, I have traffic from division. They're recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross for today's action." The citation reads, "Extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations involving conflict with an armed enemy." The award represented the second highest decoration for valor in the United States military, recognition reserved for actions that went significantly beyond normal expectations of duty and courage. But for Blackthorn, the real recognition had come from Staff Sergeant Reeves and the other SEALs whose handshakes carried the weight of men who understood the difference between theoretical bravery and practical heroism demonstrated under fire. As she walked toward the debriefing that would capture lessons learned for future reference, Blackthorn reflected on the subtle transformation that had occurred during 4 hours of impossible flying. The mockery that had created her call sign had evolved into respect earned through demonstrated competence under the worst possible conditions. The Hindu Kush Mountains remained as hostile and unforgiving as they had been that morning, but 12 American warriors were alive who might otherwise have become statistics in the long war against global terrorism. In the end, that was the only metric that truly mattered. Tomorrow would bring new missions, different challenges, and the ongoing requirement to balance human ambition against the limitations of mechanical systems. But today had proven that sometimes, when everything seemed impossible, the right person in the right aircraft could still find ways to bring everyone home alive. The legend of Blackthorn had been born in mockery but earned through professionalism, validated under conditions that tested every aspect of her training and character. It was a legend she had never sought but would carry forward into whatever challenges lay ahead in the perpetual conflict between human determination and the hostile forces that sought to prevent warriors from completing their missions and returning to those who waited for their safe arrival. The debriefing room filled with personnel whose curiosity about the successful rescue mission mixed professional interest with personal admiration for someone who had accomplished what they had all declared impossible. Intelligence officers wanted tactical details about enemy positions and capabilities. Maintenance personnel sought technical information about aircraft performance under extreme conditions. Medical staff required timeline data to correlate treatment decisions with patient outcomes. But underlying all the professional inquiries was a recognition that they had witnessed something that transcended normal military operations. The rescue of Neptune 6 had become a case study in the relationship between individual competence and mission success under conditions that challenged every assumption about acceptable risk and achievable outcomes. Major Sarah Kim, the division's senior intelligence analyst, led the formal debriefing with questions designed to extract actionable intelligence from the day's events. Can you describe the enemy positions and approximate strength of forces that engaged your aircraft during the landing phase? Blackthorn consulted her kneeboard notes, mental images still fresh despite the passage of several hours since the firefight. Initial contact came from elevated positions on the ridgeline northeast of the landing zone. Small arms fire, probably AK-47s, and one possible heavy machine gun based on muzzle flash patterns and impact signatures on the aircraft. Estimated 8 to 12 personnel based on volume of fire and position spacing. The technical details mattered for future missions in the area, but everyone in the room understood that the tactical intelligence was secondary to the human drama that had played out in weather conditions that defied normal flight operations. The enemy had been competent and well-positioned, but they had been defeated by determination and flying skills that operated beyond conventional parameters. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the base's senior flight surgeon, asked the medical questions that would inform crew health and welfare policies. What was your assessment of crew performance under extreme stress? Did anyone exhibit signs of degraded decision-making or coordination difficulties? The question touched on human factors that could determine mission success when aircraft systems were pushed beyond normal operating envelopes. Blackthorn considered her answer carefully, recognizing that her response would influence future crew selection and training requirements for high-risk operations. Morrison maintained professional competence throughout the mission, even when managing multiple system failures simultaneously. Santos performed both crew chief and medical duties under combat conditions while the aircraft was taking effective fire. Both exceeded normal expectations for performance under stress. Her answer was factual but carried implications that everyone present understood. The successful mission had required not just pilot skills, but crew coordination that functioned effectively when individual survival instincts might have counseled different courses of action. The team had worked as an integrated unit, even when circumstances suggested that failure was the most probable outcome. Colonel Chen asked the strategic question that would influence future policy decisions. In your professional opinion, would you recommend similar rescue operations under comparable conditions, or should today's mission be considered an acceptable exception to normal operational parameters? The question went to the heart of military decision-making processes that balanced mission requirements against acceptable risk levels. Blackthorn's answer would carry weight in future